Hello, this is Jim Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have U.S. kills 14 in strikes on 4 alleged drug boats in Pacific from BBC.com, posted by Patom13. And yeah, personally, I don't think that's good. I don't think the U.S. should just be bombing and drone striking people without well, for any reason whatsoever, really. But, ultimately, the U.S. government has a legal monopoly on these force justified bombing or drone striking whoever it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing people can do about it. That's why, if I bombed or drone striked people for decades on end, relentlessly, without ever even hinting at stopping, I would be held up as an international terrorist and war criminal. But the U.S. government does it, and it's just Tuesday, so it just goes to show you that it's pirates and emperors. When an individual does something, it's a crime. When the government does something, it's just the law, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Texas sues Tylenol makers J&J and Kenvue, claiming they hid drugs autism risks, from ctvnews.ca, posted by CH4Locks, and that's crossposted from the news of the stupid subreddit. And yeah, personally, I would say that, if you believe that J&J and Kenvue knew that Tylenol would cause autism, which, personally, I'm not sure if I buy, but, let's see if you believe that. I would say the libertarian position is you should let the free market side rather than have the state sue them. And, yeah, personally, I don't really care for big pharma like J&J and Kenvue, but ultimately, the libertarian position is the way to get out of big pharma, just like the way of getting out of big business, is a truly free market rather than a state-controlled market. The state has given tons of benefits to J&J and Kenvue over the years, and that's why they're at the top of the food chain when it comes to big pharma. But I don't think two wrongs make a right in this instance. The libertarian position is make your own medicine rather than have big pharma make it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Ronald Reagan on terrorists, posted by Plasman30, and that's a YouTube video from the Reagan Library, President Reagan's radio address on free and fair trade on April 25th, 1987. And they added, I like 80s Republicans better than 2025 Republicans. And yeah, personally, I would say I personally care for Reagan a bit. I would consider him a bottom 5. I would consider him a worse president than Trump was personally. But I do think he was probably better than Trump when it comes to free trade. And this clip is a good example of that. He was very anti-terrorist because he thought they went against free trade, and I would agree with that. Personally, I like when the Republicans were more the free trade party. They still had a lot they still had a lot of problems with social issues, but they used to be for free trade, and now it's kind of the opposite. They're more the party for protectionist economics. Well, the Democrats used to be more the socially libertarian party, but now the Republicans are arguably more socially libertarian. I would say, especially since the Democrats will let people get away with anything they want to as long as they have the right skin color or pronouns. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have truck hauling aggressive monkeys carrying herpes and COVID overturns in Mississippi, from ActionNews5.com, posted by Ragnar OKXG. And yeah, personally, I don't think we should be experimenting on monkeys and having them carry stuff like herpes and COVID, but ultimately, people are going to justify if they want to experiment on monkeys and transport them around with herpes and COVID. I personally think that's a big problem. But, ultimately, if they want to justify doing it, sometimes there's nothing you can do. Ultimately, people are going to justify, and sometimes there's nothing that you can do about it. Maybe someday someone's going to come start shoot bullets at you, and kill you, like what happened to Charlie Kirk. I personally don't really care for that. People are going to justify, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. I mean, this is a good example of that. I personally don't really care for all the science animals used for experiments with like giving them herpes and COVID and all that. But yeah, ultimately they're going to justify if they justify, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it, as I said. Next, we have Texas judges can now refuse to officiate gay weddings on religious grounds from Cron.com, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan. That's a cross post from the LOL subreddit. And yeah, personally, I'm 50-50 on this when it comes to looking at it from a libertarian perspective. On one end, I think employers should be able to offer, opt-outs to their employees if they don't feel like doing something. So I do think this is a good from a perspective of religious freedom. But with that being said, sometimes when you're on the job, you have to do something you don't want to do. I think that's important to remember as well. Ultimately, I think the libertarian position is, as long as there's a judge that would officiate a gay wedding, other judges should be able to opt out, and I think that's that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have executive order to go back to steam catapults or new aircraft carriers coming. In parentheses, millions more dollars in waste incoming from TWZ.com, posted by CH4Locks, and that's a cross post from the aviation subreddit. And yeah, personally, I would say that I personally wouldn't want to go back to steam catapults. But ultimately, I think the libertarian position here is that the government shouldn't be forcing aircraft carriers to abide by any standards. They should all make their own standards. If they want to go back to steam catapults, they should be able to. But if they want to keep using whatever they're currently using, they should be able to as well. The government shouldn't have any say on how anything is made, and that includes aircraft carriers. And you could make the argument, well, a lot of aircraft carriers are going to be bought by the government through the Navy and all that. But personally, if they want to make an aircraft carrier that the government wants to buy, they should be able to. And if the government doesn't want to buy it, they shouldn't be forced to do so if they don't want to. But so yeah, personally, I don't really care for steam catapults. But if that's what the government wants, they should be able to do that. But I think the libertarian position is, make aircraft carriers however you feel like with or without them, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have shutdown has put food stamp benefits at risk from CNN.com, posted by Socialists Are Morons, and then they added, watch Democrats fold in 3, 2, 1. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian perspective is, food stamps are probably one of the better things that taxpayer dollars go towards. But with that being said, I don't think people should be forced to pay for anything if they don't feel like it, and that does include food stamps. I think the libertarian position is, some government benefits might help the underprivileged, but ultimately, I think people should try to be as independent as possible, because ultimately the government can take away whatever benefits feels like. If you're living on government benefits, they can take away those benefits in 8 seconds. Sometimes there's nothing you can do about it, like we were seeing here. So yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, if food stamps are a well-intentioned program, but I think the libertarian position is, you should try and be as independent as possible. If you need food stamps, I think I think you should be able to get them, especially if you're unable to work. But you should definitely try and be as independent as possible, regardless of that, because you just can't rely on food stamps forever. You need to have some of your own capital as well, and I think that's very important. People should try and be as self-reliant as possible, even if they do need food stamps. Next, we have Trump needed to be guided around a single room by Japan's prime minister, posted by Donald Key, and that's crosspost from the Mayor McCheese subreddit. And let's look at a TikTok of him doing that from the David Pacman show. And of course, Reddit's always going to be like, Trump's senile, he's going to die any day now, but also, oh, Trump's a dictator, he's going to run for a third term and win. And it just goes to show you, it's very much the enemy is both strong and weak. I think that's one of the signs of fascism. But when Reddit does it, it's not fascism, because Reddit can't be. Reddit's always in the right according to themselves. So that's why eventually you just can't take it very seriously. It's very much people who want to circle jerk their own things about how bad Orange Man is and how he's going to die any day now, but also that he's going to be a permanent dictator and never leave office. So that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have MSNBC. Senator, is it constitutional for President Trump to run for a third term? Tommy Tuberville. If you read the Constitution, it says not, but he says he has some different circumstances that I might be able to go around the Constitution. Posted by FlimsyOut5563, and that's crosspost from the Law subreddit. And that looks like, I guess, Tommy Tuberville saying that on MSNBC. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian perspective here is, term limits are inherently anti-democratic. But, personally, as a libertarian, democracy is simply tyranny of the majority. A lot of edgy people say, oh, women shouldn't be voting these days. Personally, I think the libertarian perspective is no one should be voting and making decisions for anyone else, and that's my thoughts there. I personally don't really care for the politicians who oversee their welcome, like Donald Trump, in my opinion. But ultimately, if he's gonna run for a third term, I personally don't think they'll let him. But he seems to always find a way around things. So I guess we'll have to wait and see on that front. I think the big thing to blame here though is FDR for breaking the two-term tradition in the first place so much they had to enshrine in the Constitution for the 22nd Amendment. But, ultimately, it comes down to who has the resources to justify what. And I think Trump has blown enough of his social and economic capital at this point that he won't be able to run to a third term even if he wants to. But I guess, as I said, we'll have to wait and see on that front. Then we have Trump. If I want to enact a certain act, I'd be allowed to do that. You understand that. The courts wouldn't get involved. Nobody would get involved. And I could send the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. I could say, and anybody I wanted. Posted by Swan Panky Dan. And that's a cross post from the Law subreddit. It looks like a clip of Trump saying that, I guess. And yeah, personally, I don't usually like to agree with Trump, but he's right here. He's pretty much been showing he's been able to get away with whatever he feels like since he's the president. And a lot of people are going to defer to the president as whatever the law, as the interpretation of the law is, and that's very much what the law is. It's whatever people in power say it is. And since Trump is in a position of authority, he pretty much could get away with that, I think, if he wanted to. And not that I particularly care for that. I think it's very much statist, authoritarian rhetoric. But, it just goes to show you that, when people are in positions of power, they can get away with things that other people can't. And Trump's a good example of that. Next, we have MSNBC. Senator is constitutional for Donald Trump to run for third term. Time to do, if you read the Constitution, it says it's not, but he says he has some different circumstances, maybe not able to go around the Constitution. Cross from the Law subreddit by Dr. 07. Yeah, we already talked about this, but yeah, personally, I think people are tired of Donald Trump, but, ultimately, it just comes down to, whether people are going to accept it if he does run for third term, just like everything else. People have accepted him, everything he's done this far, maybe they'll accept that as well. Personally, I think, a lot of people are going to draw the line there, though, especially because people are very tired after hearing him talked about every single day for over a decade at this point. People are tired of the constant orange man bad, orange man good circle jerks, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, we proudly make things here. California distillery owner says Scottish should dump Trump's tariffs from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, I would agree with that. But, ultimately, like for everything else, if Trump wants to implement tariffs, he's in a position of authority to do so. I personally think they go against free trade and the free market. But, ultimately the government's going to justify doing whatever it feels like, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have Trump tells military he's deploying troops against Americans, whether people like it or not, and alludes to using missiles against Americans, posted by CH4Locks, and that's a cross post from the Cringe TikTok subreddit. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that, but, as I said, Trump can justify pretty much whatever he feels like, and oftentimes he's not going to be held accountable for it, and that's my thoughts there. Next, we have 2 Illinois National Guard members speak out. I won't turn against my neighbors from CBSNews.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, I hope they are the first of many. And yeah, personally, I respect that. Just because you're an agent of the state doesn't mean you have to follow all the state's orders. I think it's interesting. A lot of people Reddit says, oh, just because the Nazis, the big problem with them is that a lot of the rank and file were just following orders rather than thinking for themselves. But if this was something that the left didn't like the Texas judges and saying, oh, you're allowed to not perform same-sex marriage on religious grounds if you don't want to. And Reddit would say, oh, they have to follow whatever the law says. And it just goes to show you, it just determines who's in the in-group and who's in the out-group, I'm sure if the National Guard was called up against, if the excuse was, oh, they need to quell the epidemic of white supremacy, Reddit would say these National Guard members are very, very bad. They need to follow whatever the orders are. But since the orders are seen as being from the out group rather than the in group, Reddit will think this is the greatest thing ever, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump administration moves to overrule state laws protecting credit reports from medical debt from APnews.com. Posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I don't think that sounds good, but, the Trump administration has done a lot of stuff that I don't think sounds good, and, this subreddit's definitely going to go over everything that, isn't very good for the Trump administration does. It won't go over anything that positive that he does, because, I do think he's done some positive things, but Reddit won't Reddit only always needs to have the orange man bad narrative. But regardless, I personally don't really agree with this. Ultimately, I think it's the free market needs to decide if it wants credit reports to have medical debt or not, and the state shouldn't be deciding it. So I think the libertarian perspective is get the state out entirely, let the free market decide in that regard. Next, we have DOJ indicts Democratic congressional candidate Kat Abu-Ghazala over ICE protests from NBCNews.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added the indictment, which was filed October 23rd, alleged that Abu-Ghazala physically hindered and impeded an agent who was forced to drive at an extremely slow rate of speed to avoid injuring any of the conspirators. Abu-Ghazala was charged alongside 5 other people, including 2 other political candidates. And yeah, personally, if you ever get in the way of law enforcement, they can charge you with pretty much anything they want to, and this is a good example of that. But of course, Reddit's gonna simp for her because they think she's doing it for a good reason. I'm sure she was stopping them from if the shoe was on the other foot and it was a Republican congressional candidate stopping a branch of law enforcement for doing something that Reddit likes, Reddit would say it's the worst thing ever. But since Reddit, of course, it's only in-group good, out-group bad at this point, Reddit would think she's stunning and brave, and I want her to be president, I guess, She's personally, I personally, it's not someone I really care for, I hate all the left-wing influencers who just seek to dominate and control the narrative. She's not even probably one of the worst in that regard. I think there's worse people like David Pacman or Sam Cedar, but regardless, I do think she was also married to that Ben Collins, who was NBC's chief disinformation officer for a while before they got rid of him, and that's another person I really don't care for. And she also used to work at Media Matters. I remember when she got fired from there, and Media Matters is very much a propaganda arm of the DNC, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump's move to replace 12 ICE directors can mean more aggressive and unconstitutional immigration enforcement from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but ultimately, the state's going to justify whatever it feels like. And yeah, I personally think it's interesting how Reddit's simping for ICE directors here because, they're seen as being more in-group rather than the out-group, even though they think ICE is literally the Gestapo, because it just goes to show you that, Reddit's going to be against whatever the orange man is for, and other than that, they really have not too many principles. Next, we have Libertarian Socialism is, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan, and they shared a quote, Libertarian Socialism is a political ideology that opposes both capitalism and state-controlled socialism, prioritizing individual liberty, worker self-management, and decentralized anti-authoritarian political organization. It advocates for a society where the means of production are owned and controlled by the workers themselves rather than by private interests through the state. And they link to the Libertarianism page for Libertarian Socialism, the Wikipedia page for Libertarian Socialism, and the Anarchist Library page for what is Libertarian Socialism. And yeah, personally, I think Libertarian Socialism is kind of an oxymoron, like, Jewish Nazi or small government Republican. Well, I guess there are some small government Republicans like Thomas Massey. But regardless, I think if people do want to do socialism and they don't want to force other people to do it, I think they should be able to. But I think socialism is inherently going to be forced collectivist rather than voluntary collectivist. So that's why I'm very much against it. The libertarian perspective is, if you want to form voluntary collectives, you should be able to, but we shouldn't have any forced collectives like we have currently with democracy and one centralized state. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have charges dropped. Tennessee authorities dismissed charges against man who posted Trump meme from newschannel5.com, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan, and that's a cross post from the law subreddit. And I'd agree with that. I don't think you should be arrested for just posting anything on social media. But, Reddit, when that Douglas Mackey posted text your vote for Hillary and the Biden administration went after him for it, Reddit said, oh, that's fraud. He needs to be arrested and thrown in jail. And it just goes to show you, Reddit will justify social media arrest when it's the out-group, when it's the in-group doing it rather than the out-group. But when the out-group does it, it's suddenly the worst thing ever. And yeah, personally, I think libertarian perspective is to be against libertarianism, wherever it comes from someone who's more in the in-group or more in the out-group. But, of course, Reddit, they have no principles. It's only in-group good, out-group bad, and that's pretty much every single post. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.